Is Charles Oliveira overrated, underrated, or properly rated? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. So starting with Charles Oliveira's accomplishments, so Oliveira has a professional MMA record of 35 wins and 11 losses. His UFC record, which is what matters the most if we're being honest. I know he went on a crazy win streak before signing to the UFC, but they were all bot lobbies, and if you took all those wins away from Charles Oliveira, it would not change how we view his career as of right now, in my opinion anyway. Throughout his entire MMA career, he has got 10 wins by KO/TKO, 21 wins by submission, 4 wins by decision. His UFC record in terms of his finish rate is actually 82.6%, but we've rounded it up to 83. His biggest win streak in the UFC was 11 fights. On the way through those 11 fights, he did become UFC lightweight champion. Like it says below, he's a former UFC champion. He has got the most subs in UFC history. Some other titles that Oliveira owns are he has got the most finishes in UFC history, most post-fight bonuses in UFC history, and the most performance of the night awards. Oliveira has got a lot of accomplishments inside of the UFC. Moving on, we're staying with the positives, and this is Charles Oliveira's most notable wins. Obviously, as you can see on screen, there's a lot more names that Oliveira has on his resume, but we're only going to be going through the big names, the key victories that he has on his resume. Starting off with Michael Chandler, he has beat him 2 times. His last fight with Michael Chandler was at UFC 309. Realistically, it was a nothing fight if we're being honest. It didn't make any sense whatsoever for Michael Chandler to be getting another shot at Charles Oliveira, but this was a really different Oliveira in this matchup. He was a lot more patient, wasn't as wild, although he did get into a bit of trouble in the last round against Michael Chandler, but this was a really composed version of Charles Oliveira that really utilizes grappling and uses range really well against Michael Chandler. It was a good performance overall outside of the last round, but a bit of a nothing win in my opinion. His first fight with Michael Chandler, however, Michael Chandler was coming in from all the hype from him being a Bellator. He got that win over Dan Hooker, got in there with Charles Oliveira for the vacant UFC lightweight title. He hurt Oliveira and nearly got him out of there at one stage of that fight. Michael Chandler looked like he was on his way to actually beating Charles Oliveira. I can't remember how the lines were looking, but I think Michael Chandler might have been a favourite. But Oliveira actually caught Michael Chandler with a left hook, finished him up with some ground and pound to become the new UFC lightweight champion. And for those who would have been watching Charles Oliveira's career for a while, let's just be honest, nobody thought this guy was going to become UFC lightweight champion. Maybe towards the end of his 11 fight win streak before he got to the title fight, maybe people were starting to see it, but before that, no. Oliveira, especially early on in his career, was a win one, lose one fighter. His Beneil Dariush win, in my opinion, is criminally underrated. Beneil Dariush was on a crazy win streak, coming off that Gamrot win. Beneil Dariush arguably should have been fighting for a title before he fought Charles Oliveira in this matchup, and I actually picked Beneil Dariush to beat Michael Chandler. Or Beneil Dariush to beat Charles Oliveira, sorry. I actually picked Beneil to win this matchup. I thought he was going to be able to catch and hurt Oliveira, and I thought he would have been able to go to the ground with Oliveira because Beneil is a really established grappler. That did not happen at all. Charles Oliveira absolutely smoked him in there in the very first round. He beat the living piss out of Beneil Dariush. Smoked him, absolutely destroyed him. Great win, and not a lot of people talk about the Beneil Dariush win, which I think he should get a lot of credit for. Moving on to his Justin Gaethje win, I'm counting this as a title defense. I don't give a fuck what anybody says. This is a title defense. What a performance from Charles Oliveira. Typical Oliveira fashion. Came through a lot of adversity. In the build-up, Justin Gaethje was saying he was going to show people that Oliveira was a quitter. That was not the case at all. That right hand Oliveira caught Justin Gaethje with, that was fucking insane. That was literally, he actually punched through Justin Gaethje's fucking watermelon head in that matchup, took his back and submitted him. One of his best performances. I know he got dropped in it, but still a really good, emphatic finish in that matchup. He smoked Justin Gaethje. Another name on his resume, which is technically his only title defense, and that is against Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier was coming into this fight off the Dan Hooker win and the 2 McGregor wins. Really should only be one in their rematch. Third fight doesn't count. But anyway, Dustin Poirier was getting his title fight against Charles Oliveira. Again, typical Oliveira fashion. He gets hurt a lot of people were picking Poirier to win this one, if I remember correctly, just because of how chinny's not the word to describe. Maybe chinny is the word to describe Oliveira, but he's got great recovery. But anyway, Dustin Poirier was beating him up on the feet. Then you seen Oliveira mixing his grappling. He ended up being in Poirier's full guard for nearly a full round, if I remember correctly, but landed some disgusting grounding pound on him. And this is where Oliveira literally just said, right, fuck this shit. Climbed Dustin Poirier like a fucking jungle gym and subbed him. Submitted Dustin Poirier by rear naked choke. Bro climbed him like a fucking tree. Another great win. A top 5 lightweight of all time is Dustin Poirier. Great win to have on your resume. Tony Ferguson. Yo, this is a good win to have. I know it hasn't really aged well because Tony kind of fell off a lot after this fight. But this was Tony in his prime still. I don't give a fuck what anybody says. Tony Ferguson was coming off that loss to Justin Gaethje. Before then, people were saying this guy was going to beat Khabib Nurmagomedov and shit like that. Yes, he took a beating against Justin Gaethje, but he hadn't lost in God knows how many years before the Gaethje fight. And Oliveira absolutely beat him up. I'm surprised Oliveira actually didn't rip his arm off with that armbar. Tony Ferguson is a great win to have. I've also chucked on Kevin Lee there. Former interim title challenger. Might not be the best win to have, but a big name to have on your resume. Also, an underrated win that he has is Jared Corden as well. Oliveira has got a lot of notable wins on his resume. Now we get on to the bad part, Oliveira's losses. Now you might be saying, why have I included all of Oliveira's losses on screen, but I didn't include all of his wins? This is just, we're just going to go through his losses and talk about them, because there's some losses Oliveira has to certain opponents and you're like, that's actually not that bad of a loss to have. Like, these guys are all-time greats. And then some of them, and the way he lost, you're like, what the fuck happened? Where did it all go wrong here? So starting off with Ilia Topuria, not a bad loss to have on your resume. Oliveira arguably shouldn't have even been in there with Ilia Topuria. He didn't deserve that title shot, if we're being honest. He did commit. It's not a bad loss to have in Ilia Topuria. I think he's already top 10 all time. The performance Oliveira had is my problem. It was the most dog shit game plan I've ever seen in my life. Why the fuck are you not staying at range with someone like Ilia Topuria? Why are you closing the distance with him? It just didn't make any sense. But again, not a bad loss to have on your resume. Arman Tsarukyan, again, Arman Tsarukyan, number 1 contender in the lightweight division. And this was a competitive fight. I mean, Oliveira nearly had him out of there on multiple occasions. Some people say that Oliveira should have beat Arman. No, Oliveira shouldn't have beaten Arman. Arman was the rightful winner at UFC 300, although it was a good performance from Oliveira. But again, this is kind of a trap that Oliveira falls into when he fights these brother wrestler type of guys. I understand he's got really good jiu-jitsu and he's got a really good game off his back, but he lets these guys spend too long in his guard. And especially when this fight was 3 rounds, you can't be doing that shit. So again, bit of an IQ issue there. Or maybe it might have been he just couldn't get Arman Tsarukyan off him, or the fact that he nearly submitted him a couple of times. But that is a problem with Oliveira that I think cost him in this matchup. Islam Makhachev, again, not a bad loss to have on your resume. When Islam beats JDM, he's the greatest of all time in my opinion. However, it goes back to the Ilia Topuria. The game plan for Islam was horsecock. It was shit. It was so shit. On the feet, he offered Islam nothing. He got dropped. He tried to fucking pull guard on Islam. Yo, I haven't forgiven him for this loss. He tried to pull guard on Islam Makhachev. Insane. Now, this is where stuff gets a bit, by what the hell, by. Paul Felder beat the living piss out of Oliveira. Yeah, go back and watch that fight. This is kind of where people were saying he was maybe a bit of a quitter and shit like that. Paul Felder fucked Oliveira's shit up. Paul Felder got in his guard and the grounding pound was brutal. Again, not a great loss to have in your resume, but there's definitely worse. Paul Felder was ranked inside of the top 10 in the lightweight division for a while. Ricardo Lamas. Not only did he beat Oliveira, now this was featherweight Oliveira, granted, but he submitted Oliveira. He submitted Charles Oliveira. That is not a good look. That is not a good look. Anthony Pettis subbed him as well, if I remember correctly. Anthony Pettis, former champion, not that bad. Jim Miller submitted him. Now, this was very early on in Charles Oliveira's career. Oliveira's been with the UFC since he was 20 years of age. I think he's been with the promotion from 2010, if I remember correctly. Submitted by Jim Miller isn't great. Lost a decision by Frank Yeager, former champion. Not bad. Not bad. Would help if I could fucking speak. Cub Swanson beat him, a legend of the UFC. Knocked Oliveira out. Same with Donald Cerrone. Some questionable losses there in Oliveira's career, in my opinion. A lot of guys that just don't look good to have losses against on your resume. However, this is what I will say, especially with maybe like the Jim Miller down. Oliveira had signed in the promotion at 20, and I know there's guys fighting in the UFC now that are at 20 years of age, and maybe they're like about to break the top 15 and shit like that. It's a completely different era now. It's a completely different time. And look at the names that Oliveira was in there with when he was early on. This guy learnt on the job. That is probably the best way to describe Oliveira in the UFC. This guy learnt on the job. Yes, he was good enough to get into the UFC, but this guy really crafted his skills on the job in the UFC. You know, this guy didn't learn on like Cage Warriors or the PFL or came up through the Contender Series. This guy learned through finding some of the biggest names in the UFC. That's where this guy was able to learn his craft. So some of these losses I think you have to have a bit of leeway for because of his age and because of the experience that these guys had over him. I think you do have to give a bit of leeway for Charles Oliveira in certain particular losses. Some of them though you can't defend. People might say, where's Max Holloway? I'm not putting the Max Holloway loss up here. It was an injury, a weird injury that Oliveira had. I'm not putting that on here. Finally, the verdict on Oliveira's career. Look, this guy's got a really die-hard fan base. I'm sure a lot of people might get into the comments and say, no, he's underrated. I think Charles Oliveira is perfectly rated by the masses of MMA fans. Obviously, you do have like his die-hard cult fan base that will say like, he's the best lightweight ever, or he's top 10 all time and shit like that. I don't think Oliveira is top 10 all time personally. I don't even know if I would have him in top 15. I would really need to have a think of my 15 to 10 range. I think personally he's properly rated. I don't see anybody I don't see like a large group of people really overrating him, to be honest. And he's certainly not underrated. I think Charles Oliveira is perfectly rated by the MMA community. You might say that's a cop-out answer, but I just think it's fair. I think he is properly rated. I can't say he's overrated, and he's definitely not underrated, in my opinion. Let me know what fighter you want me to do next, and as always, let me know your opinion in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and I'll see you all again in the next one.